Continuing from last segment, if you recall, I talked about the Gaza Strip raid in which Nasser really felt humiliated. This was a raid that Israelis pulled against the garrison in the Gaza Strip. And after that event, Nasser decided that he needs to get better military equipment. So the last segment ended with his request for arms from the United States. The request really confronted Eisenhower administration with an impossible dilemma. Both foreign and defense bureaucracies favored selling arms to Nasser for the very basic reason that they considered Nasser a very important element in the containment strategy against Soviet penetration in the Middle East. But the truth of the matter was that no American administration could supply arms to a deadly enemy of Israel without paying an extraordinarily exorbitant domestic political price. So the response of the Eisenhower administration to Nasser's request for arms was to put off answering the request rather than rejecting it outright. So we stonewalled because we could not make up our mind. As you can imagine, procrastination is a typical behavioral pattern when there are conflicting objectives. So on the one hand, we wanted to have Nasser on our side because of the containment objective. On the other hand, our other interest that I will mention briefly to make sure we can protect the state of Israel, that worked against it. In the meantime, a vicious cycle of raid and counter-raids continued to give definition to the Arab-Israeli conflict. At certain point in 1955, exacerbated Nasser decided that he could no longer wait for our answer, and therefore he went to the Soviet Union and asked them if they are willing to sell him arms. The Soviets said yes, they are willing to do that, and actually they appeared sympathetic to Nasser's need. Therefore, the Soviets arranged for Nasser to get some arms from Czechoslovakia, which was part of the Soviet empire in that period. And I use the word empire as more of a description of the reality than a formal formal designation of that entity. Now, by going to the Soviet Union, you can imagine how Secretary of State John Foster Dulles would feel about that. Remember now, Dulles was a quintessential Cold Warrior, and therefore, as you can imagine, he did not take kindly to Nasser's warming up to the Soviet Union and taking with him Arab nationalist forces in their direction. So, in anger because of Nasser's move towards Soviet Union, Dulles decided to cancel American funding for the Aswan High Dam project, which had been all but approved by the Eisenhower administration. It still had a hurdle of passing the Congress, and some have argued that it probably would have not passed the Congress. But be that as it may, this was a very, very important project that we were going to fund because it was the key to, or a key to, economic recovery for Egypt. If you recall, I talked about the demographic pressure and the need for arable land for Egypt to be able to feed its population. So Aswan High Dam figured prominently in Nasser's priority to deal with the challenges of Egypt's economy and demography. So when we decided to cancel the funding for Aswan High Dam, Nasser, in response, nationalized the Suez Canal. This, as you can imagine, in turn outraged the British and the French. in the case of the canal, the British owned most of the canal stocks, but the French were equally hostile toward Nasser for a host of reasons. First of all, the French had endured one humiliation after another since World War II. Remember, they were attacked first in the Western Europe by the Germans. At the end of the war, they were forced by her allies, especially England, Britain, to evacuate Syria and Lebanon. They had been defeated in Indochina and also booted out of North Africa, and especially Morocco and Tunisia. And in North Africa, really, they were about to be kicked out of Algeria, which they did not consider their colony. They viewed Algeria as almost a physical part, a province of France. Their hatred for Nasser was related to the fact that Egyptians' intelligence was deeply involved in support for the Algerian rebels. So therefore, the French had a lot of reason for hating Nasser. So what the British and the French wanted to do was to use the nationalization of the canal as a pretext to knock off Nasser and put in his place person who they considered a moderate responsible, and by now you should know his name. His name was Nahas Pasha, the person that the British relied on to declare war against the Axis. Now, up to this point, what is interesting is that Israel was pretty isolated, and suddenly she found herself surrounded by two new allies, Britain and France. Moreover, in this context, as far as it relates to Israel, when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, he also placed a blockade on shipping bound to Israel going through the Strait of Tiran. Now, to better understand what happened next, so you have now three powers. You have Britain, you got France, and you got Israel. To better understand what is this event going to lead to, or these potential alliance between these three will lead to, we really need to look a little bit beyond the Middle East. At the same time, there is another important event that is occurring in Eastern Europe, and that's the Hungarian Revolution. I should add that the Hungarian Revolution really got its impetus from the United States radio that was broadcasting, encouraging the Hungarian to rebel against their Soviet oppressors. And the idea was, or at least the intimation in those messages was, that if they do rise up against the Soviet, the United States may be coming to their help. So these poor people actually ended up believing something that we absolutely couldn't have done. We couldn't have gone to Hungary without risking a nuclear conflagration. So the Hungarians rise up and they see themselves being crushed by the Soviet Union. So the point of this is that the Dulles administration, the American, not the Dulles, the Secretary of State, I should say, the Eisenhower administration, we are all focused on Eastern Europe. So with United States attention diverted to Eastern Europe, the three powers that I mentioned, Britain, France, and Israel, collude to come up with a secret invasion plan against Nasser. The plan was befittingly codenamed Operation Musketeer, after Alexandre Dumas' Three Musketeer novel. The main aim of the invasion plan was to topple Nasser, put Nahas Pasha, and reestablish status quo ante in Egypt. That is, the status quo that existed prior to the nationalization of oil, minus Nasser as its ruler. So Israel invades Sinai on October 29, 1956, and they are very successful. They occupy the area. Britain and France had worked out a secret deal in which they would tell both quote-unquote belligerents to engage in ceasefire in place. In other words, as Israel is occupying the Egyptian land, call it ceasefire with the occupying forces in place. And they knew full well that since this ultimatum to the so-called quote-unquote belligerents was so clearly favorable to Israel, Israel will gladly accept the ultimatum, whereas in the case of Egypt, they will reject it, especially given Israelis' advances into Sinai. By rejecting the ultimatum from Britain and France, that would then serve as the pretext for the Britain and France to join the war on Israel's side and knock off Nasser. It became obvious to everyone that this was a clear case of collusion of Britain, France, and Israel. French issued an ultimatum to stop the fighting in place. When Egyptians refused, the French bombed Alexandria and Cairo, and the British invaded. This is better known as tripartite aggression, became later on known, of course, as the Suez War. Next, the Soviet Union comes to the aid of Egypt and issues an ultimatum. But the British, the French, and Israel, they actually not take that very seriously. But then the United States told Britain and France in no uncertain terms that they must get out. Otherwise, United States economic aids and support will end. This time, everyone took that ultimatum seriously. I should mention that Eisenhower was a very kind man, but he could become a very angry man. And he was very much angered by British and French collusion while he was focusing on Eastern Europe to go behind his back and invade Egypt, and he wasn't about to forgive them. Also, there's another dynamic going on, and that is Anthony Eden of Britain and Dulles really despised each other. They never liked each other. So with United States ultimatum, Britain and France are forced to pull out, leaving Israelis in Sinai. So this becomes another crucial moment for United States. This was really the first time as a great power that we humiliated our own allies. And in many sense, one can say that the Suez War of 1956 is important because it really marks the ending of the British and the French hegemonic domination over the Middle East. So in essence, with the United States forcing Britain and France to leave Egypt in the aftermath of the Suez crisis, everyone now knows the new kid on the block is the United States. So by the same token, it also marks the beginning of the United States preeminence and also hegemonic domination in the region. So we have an interesting situation during the Suez Canal. Recall, both United States and the Soviet Union wanted these three powers out of Egypt, that is Britain, France, and Israel. So therefore, when you think about it, during the 1956 Suez War, we were a de facto ally of the Soviet Union. And the interesting part about the Middle East and international relations as it relates to the Middle East is this. We will again become a de facto ally around 1987 during the Iran-Iraq War, and then again in 1991 when we fight Iraq. So there are these three periods in history in which we do become de facto allies, even though we were, in the broader IR picture, international relations picture, we were clearly enemies. But in 1956, we knew and they knew that our de facto alliance in the Middle East could not last so long as the Cold War existed and gave definition to the overall United States-Soviet relation. Anyway, as you can imagine, forcing the British and the French, the former colonial power now, out of Egypt made United States suddenly exceedingly, unbelievably popular with the Arabs and the Third World. And true to form, this would last about 3 months. Since very quickly, as soon as we kicked out or forced out the British and the French, we end up adopting the very same, self-same policies that they had. So a year later, less than a year later, really a few months later, because remember this was the tail end of 1956 in October, by 1957 we have a very important event, and that is the Eisenhower Doctrine being enacted. The doctrine, in essence, offered protection to Middle Eastern states threatened with aggression from Soviet Union or, and that or is important, states controlled by it. So now the question is, in the Middle East, which state was really controlled by the Soviet Union? The answer to that question was simple. By now, even though we went and saved Nasser from the aggression of Britain, Israel, and France, the real target of Eisenhower Doctrine is Egypt under Nasser, because Egypt is now seen as a satellite. So first and foremost, the Eisenhower Doctrine was directed against Egypt, and then followed by Syria. Syria was the two states, Egypt and Syria were the two states that we viewed as being controlled by the Soviet Union. The regime in both countries are now increasingly viewed by the top leadership of the State Department as being controlled by the Soviet Union. Now, I also want to mention that there seems to be a lack of symmetry between our position in 1956, October of 1956, helping Nasser, and by January and spring of 1957 when we were really trying to topple him. So how could that happen? Part of the answer is that in 1956, the image of Nasser as a satellite of Soviet, as a puppet of Soviet, had not fully crystallized. And we were really angered at the Britain and France and Israel for acting behind us and acting like colonialists that would endanger our overall containment goal. So that had not formed, so we could, at least for the few months that we asked those powers to leave the Middle East, we could appear as if we were supporting Nasser. But had that picture already crystallized earlier, probably we would have not forced the British, French, and Israelis to leave Egypt, and we probably would have not humiliated them. So this brings me to a very, very important point, and that is the significance of Eisenhower Doctrine in shaping, in defining American foreign policy toward Middle East. Not just Nasser, but what kind of a foreign policy would flow from this doctrine So that's going to be the topic that I'm going to address in our next segment.